Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. I wasn't sure how many would be here the first time around, so wow, that's pretty impressive. So thank you so much. Let me just, I want to get a feel for who is in the audience here. How many of you are local here? Oh, just about everybody. And how many of you have skied Breck, say, in the last month or so, roughly? Okay. Okay, so that's good because this will be, oops.
Sorry.
I think this will be very relevant then. This is actually a fun presentation. I sort of did this as a hobby. Am I close enough to this thing?
A little bit. Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. I sort of took this on as a hobby quite a number of years ago because, believe it or not, a lot of the people that you'll see pictures of today or stories of are still around. They're still here. And so I just sort of started talking to people and collecting photographs and things like that. And it was pretty amazing that how many of the runs at the Breck Ski Area actually mean something. And that's sort of rare in my experience anyway in ski areas in the United States, because you get a lot of these runs that are Whoopee or Heartbreak Hill or something like that, and they don't really mean anything. But a lot of the runs up at Breck, I think you'll find it interesting, actually do mean something, and they are from somewhere and or about somebody. So I think you'll find it interesting in that respect. One thing, the Breckenridge Heritage Alliance also has a ski tour that they do. Is called Ski Through History, and I'm happy one of our esteemed guides, Sharon Smith, is here. And if you're interested in putting together a group to do a Ski Through History, they go all over all four of the peaks and tell you all the same kinds of things I'm going to tell you. One thing, and with all due respect to the Breck Ski Area, one thing that I completely avoid and I almost refuse to even learn the names of is the new Peak 6. It's a wonderful skiing area, but the names mean absolutely nothing from a historic standpoint. So, okay, well let's start here. I'm going to concentrate on the naming of the runs and things like that, with relatively little about the history of the area. Although for those of you that might be interested in the history, at the end of this presentation I've got more detailed slides that actually go through every area, Peak 8, Peak 9, Peak 10, and list the significant things that happened in the history of those. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, we can do that as well. Just a very, very brief timeline. I'll let you read this. I won't read it through myself. But skiing has been around in Summit County since the early days, since 1859. And believe it or not, skiing used to be all about transportation, and it wasn't actually called skiing. Skis were called snowshoes. And so I got a picture here in just a second. They were very, very long, very clumsy skis, a single pole. And people actually use that as transportation, because in the winter, I mean, let's face it, when you're faced with 8-foot drifts of snow, pretty hard to work a horse or something like that through it. So I'll show you some pictures of these. But Dillon, back in the day, back right after World War I, was actually very famous in the ski world, because there were a couple of Norwegians here, these guys right here, that were residents of Dillon, and there was actually quite a large ski jump that was built. If you know where the glory hole on the dam is, it's just the old ski area. You can actually, or the old, it wasn't a ski area, it was a ski jump. You can actually see it if you're out on the lake. Can see it where it was. Most of it's underwater now, of course. But world records were set there in 1919 and 1920. So that was a very well-known area. There was also a similar ski jump in Breckenridge, you can look up on the hill when you're standing in the city market parking lot and see where that used to be. The first area that was actually open to the public in Summit County for actual skiing, downhill skiing like we know it, was at Hoosier Pass. And that was started sometime, a little bit hard to tell, but probably 1935, 36. And it closed down around 1940 or so. But if you're driving up towards Hoosier Pass, one of the last hairpin turns, if you look off to the left, you'll see two runs through the trees, and that's where the old Hoosier Pass area was. The second one in this area that was actually open to the public, but it was mostly used by the Climax mine employees, was at Chalk Mountain, and you can see the dates there. That is right smack on top of Fremont Pass as you're going from Copper to Leadville, and it's on your right as you're going towards Leadville. So that was shut down in the very early 60s. And then, of course, the areas that we all know, A Basin, that was started by the Durkhems, or Max Durkheim was one of the starters of that, and a couple of 10th Mountain Division people were also involved in that. And then Breckenridge came along, Keystone in 1970, and Copper Mountain in 1972. So that's sort of what happened in Summit County. These are just a couple of old pictures. This is what these skis used to look like. And I'm sure they probably, in the historic park here, probably have a couple of these old skis. This was the old Father Dyer story. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And a single pole to navigate and to stop. This is the old Breckenridge ski jump right here. And like I say, you can see the area where it was from the city market parking lot. And this is a ski club. You can see the length of the skis in 1912. So they were actually doing recreational skiing, a little bit different than we might consider skiing, but nevertheless they were out having fun in the snow. And this is a very well-known local picture anyway. I can't remember the lady's name. It was taken in the 1920s, and I always amused by Sandy Mathers. She's the president of Summit Historical Society. She made an observation that I think is so true. Why is this lady smiling and laughing? Could it be because she's got two different length skis? Okay, so let's start talking about the Breckenridge Ski Area. Some of these early stories vary a little bit depending on who you talk to. You know, over time stories get better and better and better. But a lot of the people that were involved in the very beginning still are alive. And the story actually begins in 1958. There was a guy named Bill Stark, and Bill Stark is still alive. He is in his mid-80s, lives in Seattle. We've actually interviewed him about this. He was a geologist, and he decided to take a leave of absence from his job and just go walking around in the mountains prospecting, just for the hell of it. And he was walking around in Breckenridge, and that was right about the time when the Dillon Dam and the Dillon Reservoir was being started. And he came up with the bright idea, God, this would be a great place for a summer community, second home kind of thing. And he knew a family, or was very familiar with a company in Wichita, Kansas called Rounds and Porter. And Rounds and Porter was an interesting company. They were in the lumber business. They also did timbering, I mean lumbering in the sense of cutting down trees to cut into lumber. They were also involved in oil and gas exploration and in real estate development. And Bill Stark he knew Bill Rounds, and managed to convince him that this would be a great place to actually build a residential community near the Dillon, the future Dillon Reservoir, or Lake Dillon, for a summer community. Now, one of the things that's a little bit hazy as to who came up with the idea, some say Bill Stark and some say two Norwegians that I'll just show you in just a second. But somebody also came up with the idea that, gee, there are mountains around here, and gee, there's snow on those mountains. Wouldn't this be a great ski area too? So somehow in 1958-59, the idea of a year-round recreational community came up. So Bill Rounds became very involved. Bill Rounds, you'll see a picture of him in a second. He was a very avid skier and skied out at Aspen. And they convinced him that this would be a great place to go skiing. And he came over to ski in the winter of 59 and 60 with a gentleman who's still very, very alive, Sigurd Rockney in Breckenridge. And they decided to go for it as far as building a ski resort as well as a resort that could take advantage of the lake. So they actually began building summer homes in 1960. They hadn't yet started anything on the ski area yet, but these were homes that were going to be used for recreation in the summer on Lake Dillon. And then, now get this, I mean, just think in terms of today's, how long it takes to do things. In March of 1961, Rounds and Porter actually applied for a permit, U.S. Forest Service, to build the Breckenridge Ski Area. In July it was granted. And they started work immediately. Actually, they had started in May. But on December 16th, 1961, the area opened. And again, depending on who you listen to and what you call a trail, there were either 5 or 7 different trails, and I'll show you in just a second. And the original name of the area was the Peak 8 Ski Area. That was the original name, December 16th, 1961. And you may know, some of you may know Nancy Macy, is that? She claimed to have been on the first chair. But she died about a year ago or so. She was well into her 80s. Okay, so here is what the original area looked like. There are 7 lanes there now, or trails there now, but Springmire, that I'm sure you're all familiar with, that was one of the original ones. I'll tell you a little bit later where that name came from. Swinger, that wasn't in the original, where it is now wasn't the original location, but that was one of the original runs. 4 o'clock went all the way down to where it does now, down to Park Avenue. Rounders, the current Rounders that's there, that was one of the original runs. Crescendo. And then these 2 names, Boreas Bounce and Eagle Lane, aren't used anymore, but everybody, I'm sure all of you have skied there dozens and dozens of times. Boreas Bounce is, as you're looking up slope, it's on the left-hand side. It's where that little bounce is, in between the trees there. And Eagle Lane was called that because it was so easy that when you skied down it, you sort of encouraged your ego that you could actually ski. But the first, there was one chairlift. It was the Heron number 1, and it started right about where the Colorado chair and the Rocky Mountain chair, right in that area, right there, started there. And you can still see, if you're standing there and looking directly up slope, you can see the cut going right up through this tree area here between Eagle Lane and Boreas Bounce. And you can also see it going up through the trees. It's called Boreas something now, but going up right between Rounders and High Anxiety, High A. And then there was the Bergie was in, I'm sure everybody remembers where the Bergie was before our friend's Grand timber tore it down. But it was smaller than you remember it, but that was what it looked like originally in that place. And then I'll talk a little bit more about this now, but right now where there's the giant hole there for the new building that they're going to build, where the old ticket office was and where guest services had their locker room, and there was this building right here which is used for that function. It was a ticket office and where the ski patrol changed clothes and things like that. So that's what the original area looked like. Please ask questions if...
Well, I have a
yeah.
question. I heard that in a lecture over at Colorado Mountain College on the history of the skiing area, that in the late 1950s, Breckenridge was listed among the ghost towns. Is that correct?
It was almost a ghost town, not quite. There were about 250 people. Up until about 1959, there were about 250 people here. There was no mining, nothing like that. The only reason anybody lived in Breckenridge was that it was the county seat. And it had the county offices and the school district offices, things like that. So about 250 people in the 1950s. Okay, so these are the people that made it all happen. This right here, I mentioned the geologist Bill Stark. Like I say, he's still alive up in Seattle, and we've interviewed him and got videos of him being interviewed and everything. So he was really the guy behind the whole thing. And he was actually, as soon as Rounds and Porter decided to go ahead with the development, he was the land guy. He and another guy started going out acquiring land in the Breckenridge, the downtown area, because they were going to have to build hotels and retail shops and things like that. So he and another guy eventually acquired, if you can believe this, 5,000 acres, approximately 5,000 acres of land. And they formed a company, Summit County Development Company, which is now Breckenridge Lands. And they did a lot of development work. They developed all the Highlands. That's all Breckenridge Lands. And they're one of those companies that you rarely hear about, but they are into everything. And they probably built half of Breckenridge back in the day. So Bill Stark, this is Bill Rounds right here. He died a number of years ago, but nobody seems to know when. And I've Googled him. I had a hell of a time just getting a picture of him. Really sort of interesting. I don't know why that's so.
Were any of these fellows really skiers at the time?
Oh yeah. These two guys were the other two, and they're both very much alive. Trygve Berge and Sigurd Rockne. They were ski instructors in Aspen, and they were the ones that convinced Bill Rounds that skiing was going to be great. They were both Norwegian Olympic skiers. And when the ski area actually started operation in December of '61, they were co-directors of the ski school. And Trygve stayed in that position for about 10 years, roughly. Sigurd left that position fairly early. I don't know how many years he was there, 3 to 5 years probably. And this is another picture of the Berge that was there. It was built by the time it opened. And this is the original logo, and what the original logo looked like for the Peak 8 ski area.
And the Berge was named after Trygve?
No, absolutely not. That is a sort of a local myth. It was actually called the Bergenhof, and it just, Hof means hotel in German, and Bergen, I don't know, anybody, it has something to do with hotel or restaurant, something like that in German.
Berg is mountain in German, so.
Yeah,
Bergen town.
yeah, but it was not named after Trygve. And like I say, both Trygve, you'll see him walking around. I see him at the post office all the time.
I saw him skiing last week, and he never wears a helmet.
which we always look at
Yeah.
people that don't wear a helmet like they're nuts.
Yeah.
And he always wears Norwegian sweaters still.
Yeah.
Like he's right back in the 1960s.
He's an incredible skier. Sigurd had a stroke a number of years ago. Both of them are in their 80s now. He's still very articulate and walks around and everything, but he's not able to ski anymore. So those are the people that made it all happen. Oops. Okay. Here's just I'll let you just read this, but you can see sort of a timeline of various things that happened. I was just talking about this up here. The Bergenhof restaurant was built that for that first year. Vista House was built around 97, 98. When I say put the years, that means the season, 97, 98 season. And you can see Peak 9 was originally called Royal Tiger Mountain, and it was opened first in the 71, 72 season. Peak 10 opened up in 85, 86. The 10 Mile Station restaurant came into existence 98, 99 season. And Peak 7, I can remember when Peak 7 opened up, and the Super Connect was also built and opened that season. And then the Breckenridge gondola, and it was right around Christmas, almost Christmas Day, I think, in the 2013 when Peak 6 opened up.
One went from the base of where it is today to pretty much where the tops of the...
I'm sorry, the Heron number 1?
It went pretty much
Yeah.
where the tops of the...
Yeah, that's sort of an interesting thing, because the Heron number 1, the original lift, it was a 2-seat lift, and it went from the base today where the Colorado and Rocky Mountain chairs are. It actually went up to, if you remember, where the Ski Patrol Explosives magazine was. It's not there anymore because Vail tore it down, I think, last summer to put in their zip line thing up there. But it went up above timberline, and that was a big time problem because of the wind up there. Forest Service recommended that there be no skiing, nothing built above timberline because of the wind. Turned out they were right. Breck is known for its wind, of course. And they had a lot of problem with the lift being that high. And a few years after they opened in 1961, a few years after that, they brought it down. They lowered it to roughly where the Vista House is now. And the first year, lift tickets, season or day passes cost $4. And the capacity, there are actually 2 lifts. One was the Heron number 1 double chair, and then there was a T-bar that went up. If you know where the pipe is now, the super pipe, it went up just a little ways up that area. What is that called? Fair? Can't remember the name of it, but it went up there. The next year they built a couple of other lifts, and I'll talk about those in just a second. But that's sort of a timeline for the whole area. So now let's launch into how all these names came about. Well, if you're familiar with Callie's Alley and Rounders, Rounder was Bill Round's nickname. And so Rounders, which is one of the original runs, was named after him. Callie's Alley was actually named after his wife, Callie. Her Catherine was her formal name. Like I say, Bill Rounds died a number of years ago, don't really know when. Callie was alive in Denver. We invited her up here for the Breckenridge Sesquicentennial in 2009, but she was not able to make it up. But I think she has since passed away. But that's Callie. This picture was taken in roughly 1958. And this is the entire Rounds family. Right here, there's Bill, Callie, and there's the father that started Rounds and Porter, and the mother. Now some of these other names, I don't have a picture. Springmire, actually it's spelled incorrectly now. That's the proper pronunciation. Springmire, for some strange reason that only the mountains know right now, was named after Alva Springmire. And Alva Springmire was sort of an interesting character who started out in Breckenridge in the 1940s sometime. He just sort of wandered into town, and he probably died in the very, very late 1960s or 70s, but he was just sort of an old guy that just sort of wandered around town, and he actually married a local woman who had a haberdashery shop where a gift shop. Skinny Winners, yes, thank you. Skinny Winners, that was actually her hat shop, and her husband, Alva, kept a herd of goats in the back of the shop during the winter. But Skinny Winter, and they actually lived in that log cabin that is now next to the new restaurant down there, and it's right just to the north of the Gold Pan Saloon. There's a log cabin there, and they actually lived in that. So that's Springmire. It was rumored that he was quite wealthy, and the only reason we know that is that the postmistress in Breckenridge started the whisper campaign that he received a check every month in the mail from an oil company. And he ended up investing in a lot of real estate. This is in the 1940s and 1950s. So I suspect, I've never found anyone that's been able to substantiate this, but I suspect that he owned a lot of the land that Rounds and Porter bought, and that's why he got a run named after him. I can't imagine any other reason. For those of you that know Maureen Nichols, she told me the story. She had 3 daughters in the 1960s, and she used to walk the babies and the daughters around town, and every once in a while she'd run into Alva Springmire, and he was apparently the original dirty old man. Not in a sexual sense. He was just a dirty old man. And he used to reach into his pocket, his filthy jeans pocket, and pull out unwrapped candy and give it to her daughters. And Maureen says she was horrified when that happened. But anyway, so that's where Springmire came from. 4 o'clock, that was one of the original runs, and one of the original names. That was named because that's the way you got from the ski area back to town at 4 o'clock when the area closed. I might say too that none of the runs were named originally, and when it opened in 1961, the ski area, the trail names were just numbers, and it wasn't until 63, 64 or so that they actually started naming them. So these names date from, let's say, the mid-1960s. Crescendo, that was one of the original ones, no particular meaning for that name. Same with Swinger. Boreas Bounce. Boreas was the Norse god of wind, and Eagle Lane. And Spruce was not one of the original runs. It was built in the summer of 1962, but it's just named after the Colorado tree. Okay, so here are some of the pictures of other named Trigvies. If you know where that is, that's over on, looking up slope, it's over on the extreme left, and it's a learner's area, little kids area that's named after Trygve Berge. And there's his very famous poster that locally is famous anyway. I just, at one point, quite a number of years ago, 15 years ago probably, ran into the photographer that actually took that photograph, and he said that about 10 seconds after the photograph was taken, Trygve did a garage sale. Just went all over the place. So when if you ever, you see that poster fairly frequently if you're familiar with the local scene, and you can just look at it now and know that he was that great skiing style was history in about 10 seconds. There's Sigurd Rockne, just a couple of years ago. He's actually almost a neighbor of mine. And Carol Rockne, his wife, you probably have heard of her. But there's Sigurd back in the day. And they were famous for, both of them were famous for doing car jumps. And there's a picture of them jumping over a Jeep. And you're probably all familiar with Little Johnny's. Well, he was actually called Little John Sharon. And there's the only known picture of him. He was a very, very well-known bartender at the Gold Pan, but he didn't drink. And he was a hellraiser. He was a short guy, hence Little John. And he lived over in Fairplay. He was a real hellraiser, though, and he was a lifty also. He worked as a lifty at the ski area, so that's what he looked. And this is Little Johnny's right there. Okay, you probably, maybe even today, skied down Frosty's Freeway. That's not named after Frosty the Snowman. That's named after a gentleman named Frosty Cooper, who was a cat skinner in the summer. A cat skinner is a bulldozer driver, and in the winter he drove snowcats. But that's him. 3 pictures of him. He has since passed away as well. His widow is still alive, I believe, down in Canyon City. And if you're familiar with Dukes, this is Paul Duke right here. Back in the day, he was the manager of the ski area in the late 60s. And one story that I'll tell you about him, he was considered a local hero because the original, remember I showed you the original ticket office that was built there? They actually had quite a tragedy there in January of 1966. It was a gas explosion and it blew the entire building up, and it was a tremendous fire, and there were 2 people that were caught in there, 2 women. And Paul Duke, even though he was badly burned himself, went into the burning building and pulled both of the women out. And one of the women, if any of you know Kevin Ahern, he's been head of the ski patrol since God was born, practically. One of the women was his mother. Okay, sticking still with Peak 8, if you know over looking upslope to the extreme left in the learning area over there near where Trigby's is, Dyersville is one of the names of the runs. And Dyersville is actually, you can still walk around these old buildings to the southeast of, just back in the woods, to the southeast of Breckenridge, named after Father Dyer, who was an early preacher here, Methodist preacher. And then I'll tell you a little bit more about this later, but Easy Street and Zoot Chute, if you know where those are. This is the very peak of Peak 8, and there's the top of the Imperial Chair. This is Easy Street right here, and Zoot Chute is off in here. And probably one run that probably nobody in this room has ever done, including me, is called Wacky's Chute, and it's off in the rocks. And this is who it's named after, Wacky Tim Tucker. And Wacky Tim Tucker was I'll tell you a little bit more about this group just down the way here, but Wacky Tim was a house painter in the summer, and he shoveled roofs, shoveled snow off roofs in the winter. And he's currently alive. I've talked with him on the phone, and he divides the time between Breck and Wisconsin and Chamonix in France. But Wacky's is way over in the rocks over here. It's a very narrow chute. And Zoot Chute, I'm not quite, I think it may be that one right there. Zoot Chute is that very prominent chute that goes down through the rocks. And I'll tell you how these got their names in just a little bit. Okay, again, sticking to Peak 8, A good story about High Anxiety and Goodbye Girl. They were both cut in the late 1970s. High Anxiety is over just off of Spruce on Peak 8. Goodbye Girl is that very, very steep run that goes off 4 o'clock down towards the valley that has the Super Connect in it. Back in the late 70s, the area was owned by 20th Century Fox. And they cut those 2 runs, and they gave the privilege of naming the 2 runs to the Ski Patrol. And if any of you know Nick Payne, he's the one that told me this story. He was part of this. The Ski Patrol decided that they would play a joke on 20th Century Fox. And there were 2 movies that were very, very successful the summer that they were cutting these runs. And one of them was High Anxiety, and one of them was The Goodbye Girl. And so they decided to name those 2 runs after those movies. What Fox didn't realize, though, at the time, was that High Anxiety had been produced by 20th Century Fox, but MGM Warner Brothers had produced the other one. So that's the story there. Southern Cross was one of the very, very early runs, and it was named because it was the southernmost run on the ski area there. North Star was cut much later. That was in the late 70s, and that was the northernmost run. So that's the only real reason that those 2 have those names, north and south ends of the ski area. Tiger, which is right off of Frosty's Freeway, is named after the little town of Tiger, which is right here. This is Tiger in 1926, and that was out, if you're familiar with the Swan River area and where the gravel operation is out there, that noisy, dusty, filthy, environmentally repulsive gravel operation. That is approximately where the town of Tiger was. And the town of Tiger was actually burned down by, it was a hippie place in the 60s and the 70s. And it was actually the town that was that housed the employees for the Royal Tiger mine that was just right in the trees here. But in the 60s and 70s, it became a haven for hippies. And so the Forest Service, which actually owns the land, burned it down because they wanted to get rid of the hippies. Burned it down in, I think, about 1975. The only existing building, the only surviving building now is the assay shop at the Lomax mine, the historic site that the Heritage Alliance manages. That was a log cabin that was an assay shop in Tiger. Let's see, Psychopath. That was named. It was cut, and it was originally spelled with 2 words, but it was cut, and the manager of the ski area at the time took a walk down it in the summer, and he just scratched his head and he said, "Wow, somebody would have to be a psychopath to ski on this thing." So that's the story there. Twister, the original name was Dave's Delight. Presumably Dave was one of the people that cut Twister back in the day. Mach 1 that was actually one of the very, very early runs. It was cut in the summer of 1962, and it was operational in the 62-63 season. And for some strange reason, they named it after the fact that the sound barrier had been broken in 1947. Mach 1 is the sound barrier, and somebody just had the bright idea, gee, let's honor that, and so that's where Mach 1 came from. Let's see, Tuxedo Junction, that name is no longer used, but it's we're right at the relatively flat open space at the top of Callie's Alley and Springmeyer, and it's where the old number 2 chair used to come in as well. And that used to be used a lot for weddings in the summer. So that's why what used to be called Tuxedo Junction. And just below that, there's the flat area that's right at the top of Mach 1 and where the 5 chair comes up and where, let's see, not Callie's Alley, I'm losing the name. Pardon?
Power line? Power line?
Power line, yeah, where power line came in. And then what's that, the other one begins with a C? Cascade. No, not Cascade. Crescendo. That flat area right in there is called Piccadilly Circus because of all the things that sort of intersected there. There's a very, very busy place. And Cucumber Bowl was named after one of the very early prospectors here in Breckenridge back in the 1859, 1860, a guy named Cucumber. I've never seen his last name. And the 7-Up is actually one of the, it was the second chair that was actually built here. And it was built from approximately the point where the midpoint load station is for the Super Connect down in that valley, and where Mach 1 comes in. And it went from there up through the trees, very steep. And if you really ski by there very slowly, you can still see the cut down through the trees for the 7-Up chair. Oop. Okay, so is that, yeah. So let's move to Peak 9. Remember, Peak 9 started operation in 71, 72, that season. And again, all of these names, or many of the names on 9, do have some significance. Wellington, that run there is named after what in fact was the largest mine at one point. It was right up French Gulch, the Wellington mine. It was a lead, zinc, and silver mine that operated up until 1972. Cashier is named after the Cashier mine, which is quite a rich mine that's located up in Browns Gulch, up in the Swan River area. And the Country Boy, that's the Country Boy named after the Country Boy mine up in French Gulch that is today a tourist mine. The Peak 9 restaurant, I'm sure you all remember that before Vail got a hold of it. It was owned and operated by 2 individuals. Kevin Brown, many of you probably met him up there, really, really nice guy. And his business partner died probably 5 years ago, Barbara Tunnicliffe. I don't know if any of you remember her. She was an English lady, and I never met her myself, but apparently a really, really nice person. The Mercury chair, believe it or not, used to be over, and it was in the place of the Beaver Run chair. There's the only picture I've ever seen to prove that the Merc was actually, you can't see it there, but that says Mercury, and you can see Beaver Run in the background. Do you remember that, Bob, probably? Bob Gervin, one of the people who was behind the development of Beaver Run. But the name, anyway, was moved over to the current Mercury chair, and that became the Beaver Run chair. My understanding is that the Beaver Run developers and owners insisted that that chair be named Beaver Run chair, which makes sense. And the Briar Rose run is named after the Briar Rose mine. And if you're standing in the right place, you can actually see it. This is Peak 10. You can actually see the Briar Rose mine on the slopes of Peak 10. If you look up there, you can see dumps. It's more prevalent in the summer than it is in the winter. Here's the backside of Peak 9. Sort of some interesting stories. I get all this information from C.J. Mueller, who many of you may know. I'll tell you a little bit more about him just in a minute or two. But he's been here since the early 1970s, and that was before this area, long before this area was developed. And he says that Devil's Crotch in here was named Devil's Crotch. It's a very steep, as you probably know, very, very steep run, but it was called Devil's Crotch, or when they went skiing there, the Crotch. They were going skiing in the Crotch. And when they decided to develop this area, since they already had one sort of hell-related name there, they decided to name the rest of it after things related to hell. So that's where these names, Hades and Purgatory and Inferno, came from. But an unexpected thing actually happened while they were cutting these trails that made it, you know, it's one of those things made in heaven kind of thing, and it was meant to be. The trail crew was eating lunch, and they had bulldozers out there and, you know, all their cutting equipment, eating lunch, and they had a fire there. Maybe it was cold or something. And right in the middle of their lunch, a drum of diesel fuel started rolling down the hill, rolled into the fire and exploded. So that sort of gave added impetus to the name Inferno. That's where the name Inferno came from. Another run over there is Tom's Baby. Tom Timmons, who's still a local resident here. I never met him. That's Tom right there. He was the trail crew chief that was in charge of cutting all these trails at the time, and they named it actually after Tom and Tom's Baby, not realizing that Tom's Baby was also the name of a very famous mineralogical specimen called Tom's Baby, and it was the largest mass of gold that's ever been found in Colorado, and it was found over near the Wire Patch mine in French Gulch. But so that name actually has two origins. This is the real one, Tom Timmons, and then Tom's Baby being the add-on name that was more famous than Tom was. And then Tom's mom is that one that goes down in through the trees there. So Peak 10, that started operation in 1985, 86, and the mountain manager at the time was a fellow named Jim Gill. Jim died in, I think, 1911, but I've spoken to his widow, who lives out in Edwards now. And that's a picture of Jim. That's the only one I've ever seen. But his father was a fighter pilot in World War II in the Battle of Britain. And Jim himself was an aficionado of flying. And so 5 of the names on Peak 10 are named after planes. There's quite a mishmash of names over there, but Spitfire, Mustang, Falcon is the name of the chair, and one of the south-facing, very steep runs is called Blackhawk. That's named after the Blackhawk helicopter, so that's where those names came from. Rick Hague, probably some of you remember him. He was the mountain operations manager at one point up until maybe 5-6 years ago. He was involved in the naming of all these Peak 10 runs, and he said it was quite a mishmash. The whole mountain manager wanted the planes in there. They also, management told them, let's have a Western theme, so you'll see in just a second that some of these runs have Western names, and there are other sort of funny names I'll tell you in just a second. Double Jack right here, that's a picture of double jacking. That's actually an old Cornish mining term, which refers to manual drilling underground, and that's sort of how they did it right there. Centennial is one of the main runs there. The reason that's called Centennial is that the initial planning started in 1976 on this mountain, and that was, of course, the centennial of Colorado's entry or becoming a state, and it was also the bicentennial for the United States. So that's where centennial comes from. Crystal, I'm not sure why they named that except that there is a Crystal Peak nearby, mountain. And grits and flapjack. Flapjack is probably one of the more unpleasant runs you'll ever go on. If you are familiar with that one, it's just flat and it goes forever, and it's but those two names, grits is not far from the 10-mile station. Those two names came from the fact they knew there was going to be a restaurant nearby, so that's where that came from. Bronc and Cimarron, those are the token names for the Western theme. And Dark Rider, who knows why that came out of that the book that Tolkien wrote. What was the name of that book? Anybody? Lord of the Rings. Yeah, Dark Rider came out of that. Who knows why? And 10-mile station, interesting. The name, there's 10-mile range, there's 10-mile canyon, 10-mile creek. Why was it named 10 Mile? Well, the reason is that back in the day, back in 1859, 60, 61, Breckenridge was sort of the only town of any size in this area, so a lot of people came into this area, a lot of prospectors as part of the Pikes Peak Gold Rush. And pretty soon all the claims were taken in this area, so miners wanted to move west, go west. And the question was how to go west. Well, these mountains right here would be pretty formidable as far as climbing over them to go west. And the easiest way was to go down to where Frisco is now and turn west and go up 10 Mile Canyon. And it happened that it was about 10 miles from Breckenridge, and it was also 10 peaks from Breckenridge. And that's where the originally named Peak 1, Peak 2, or Peak 3, Peak 4, Peak 10, all those names came from. Unfortunately, there were 12 peaks in that, and one of them is named Victoria, and the other is Regent. Is it? Pardon? Yeah, down in down in this right up here. So that's where the name 10 Mile came from. It was 10 miles from Breckenridge, and then you just turn left, and you could easily go west. Peak 7, that came around in 2002, 2003, that season. One of the runs, main runs, is Pioneer. That's actually named after the early fire company in Breckenridge. Fort Mary B, that was the first white man built structure in Breckenridge. It was, we think, right near City Market. And Swan City is not there anymore. It was dredged away basically. But if you go up Tiger Road, it's all dirt back in there, and you come to the cutoff to Browns Canyon. That's where this is, and you can see the former Main Street right there. Swan City's only claim to fame that I've ever seen is that Douglas Fairbanks Jr. grew up there for a while anyway. Wire Patch over on Peak 7, that's named after the Wire Patch Mine, and you can stand right just below the lift, the Independence Chair, and that's the sign there, and you can look out into French Gulch, and the big white patch out there, that's the Wire Patch Mine. And this is what it looked like back in the day. It was quite a large, important, and very rich mine. The Independence Super Chair is named after one of the 4 original mining districts here in the Breckenridge area. I won't go into what mining district was, but it was basically the only legal establishment, legal entity that provided rules for staking claims. Angels, again, we're still on Peak 7. Angels Rest, that was named after a very famous wild saloon over in Dyersville. And reportedly it was built right next to Father Dyer's retirement cabin over there. And he was a very fiery preacher and anti-alcohol preacher. So that was probably done to spite him. And Monte Cristo, the run way to the north on Peak 7, was named after the Monte Cristo mine up in Monte Cristo Gulch just before you go over Hoosier Pass. Okay, we're coming down at the end here. Again, Peak 7. Lincoln Meadows, that's actually misnamed. It should be Lincoln Park, but it was an area, a very beautiful area just above the old town of Lincoln. You can still see the town of Lincoln. If you go out there right in French Gulch, just before the end of the road, there are some houses on the north side, on the left-hand side. That was the town of Lincoln, and Lincoln Park was right above it. And these are pictures from the 1880s, 1890s of Lincoln. Claim jumper is just a generic term, and it's used today. It's when somebody robs a claim from another person. Claim jumper. Oh, this is the last part of this, but the upper reaches of Peak 7 all have these names, Debby's Alley and Vertigo, Y-Shoots. This is where CJ sort of comes into the picture. CJ was, if you've ever been here on the 4th of July, CJ is George Washington, who reads the Declaration of Independence in front of Masonic Hall. And he's you see him around all the time. He's a local guy who's been here a long time. But back in the day, back in the mid-70s, he and a bunch of other guys and women used to just go out cross-country skiing, Nordic skiing. And they would actually skin up and ski this whole area, and also over in the bowl area underneath the Imperial Chair. And for convenience sake, they decided, well, why don't we name some of these places that we like to go, so that you know, we can say, well, next Tuesday let's go out to Vertigo or something like that. So they actually informally named a lot of these places. And back in the mid-80s, 85, 86, when they built the T-bar, they opened this area up for skiing, legal skiing. And they came to, the ski patrol came to CJ because they knew he had skied a lot up in this area, and asked them, well, what are the names of these places? And so these are the names that CJ's group had given to these areas. Now, one exception was that this area, this run right here, part of the Y-Shoots, that used to be, or back in the day, was called CJ's. And when CJ gave them all these names, the management of the ski area didn't want to name or have CJ name a run after himself. And so they said, no, we can't let that one be called CJ's. So they included that in the Y-Shoots because it's shaped like a Y. But there was another run up here that was called My Line. It was named by another member of this group. And they said, okay, we'll let you name, we'll name that CJ's. So that's why CJ's is the one that goes down here. And then Debby's Alley, when I first knew CJ and he was telling me about all these stories, I asked him about where Debby's Alley come from. And he said, well, that was named after a girl named Debby, but I have no idea where she is. She used to ski with us. She was a great skier, and then she just disappeared. I have no idea where she went, but she was, one day we decided to just, we had our lunch and a couple bottles of wine, so we just sat down and at the bottom somewhere, and we just sort of pointed to various places, and One of them we named Debbie Alley. Had no idea what happened to her. Well, I actually found Debbie. Again, I'll have to pat myself on the back with that one. But I put feelers out and eventually found Debbie. And there's Debbie and her 6'4" husband, Thor. And I actually had lunch with him up in the Vista House a couple of years ago. She actually was a waitress here and tended bar. So she was just sort of a typical ski bum kind of person. But she actually went off and she went to chef's school. And she became a very talented chef and was a chef all over the world at different places. And she and her husband now live up in Washington State, and they have a couple of grown children. And she's very, very pleasant. I skied a whole afternoon with both of them. And this is a picture of C.J. Mueller, Crazy John Mueller. And he's the one that gave me most of the information about that I've just told you about the upper reaches. But CJ is sort of interesting because he's an Olympian as well, and he was a speed skier, and he competed in the 1992 Olympics at Chamonix, and it was a demonstration sport, and I think that was the only year that they ran it. And there's CJ in all his glory. But they never ran it again. But he is still living around here. He's actually lives very close to me, and was the sort of the leader of this whole group back in the day. And then I think this is my last story. If you're familiar with the run George's Thumb, everybody know where that is? Up on the shoulder of Peak 8, sort of going off into the Peak 7 bowl area. George is very much alive. I saw him at the Breck Rec Center this morning, actually, and we had a laugh over this. I told him I was going to make him famous this afternoon. But he's a local contractor, lives down near the Breck Golf Course. And back in the early 1980s, he was on ski patrol. And one day during the winter, they were doing a photo shoot for marketing purposes, and they had a bunch of models out here. And George, as a patroller, was assigned to guide them around and keep them out of trouble. Well, they had this one great shot. Everything was all aligned. The sun was out, I guess, and models were all in the right place. And so they skied across this area that is now, it's right up in there, now called George's Thumb. And they got beautiful pictures, except for the fact that George's thumb, somehow or other, had made it into the best picture. And it ruined it. And so they weren't able to use that for the marketing purposes that they intended. For some reason, the ski area, when that area opened up, they decided to call it George's Thumb. So that's why it's called George's Thumb. There's George's Thumb right there. And the ski area actually used that photograph with George's Thumb in it the next ski season on their trail map. So that's where George's Thumb came from. Oh, I guess I just got a couple more here. Arts Bowl, if you know where that is, that's Arts Bowl right there. That actually was named after Art Bowl, who was the ski area manager from 1977 until 1991, I think. Art is still very much alive. He's in his mid-80s now, but he lives over in Basalt. Still skis every day. But that was named after him. And one thing you may not realize, but if you look on a map, you'll see them. There are two sort of sub-runs in there that are named Tele and Sadie. Anybody know who Tele and Sadie were? They were the first Avi dogs. Here, so that's, okay, oh, okay, this is my last. Yeah, Well, Gary Shimanowitz, is that the mountain manager? He told me once, they is very millennial, actually, the way they did this. They decided that they were going to let the public name those runs, and they put it out on the internet. And the theme was how you should feel while you're skiing on Peak 6. So those are the names that came out of it. I don't pay any attention to those names. One interesting thing, just my final observation, I guess, sort of interesting in my quest to find these names, is that over time, from that 1961 period up until the present, you could definitely see the impact of corporate America. Originally, it was very, very personally named, and there were actual personalities like Frosty and like Trigby and Sigurd. Personalities and the names of the area reflected that. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have the most recent runs up there, Peak 6, mean absolutely nothing as far as from a historical standpoint. And you can also, Peak 7, all those names mean something, but there are no people involved there. A lot of the names originally were of people that actually took part. And I found that very, disturbing, but not surprising, that corporate America is taking over, and that's sort of what we get in one very infinitesimal area. So that's my thing. Pardon? Any questions at all?